From the private papers of the London Society of Antiquaries, accession number 1898.7.42. A leather-bound ledger, water-stained and brittle, discovered in a sealed strongbox from a solicitor's office in Exeter. The handwriting is a precise, though occasionally frantic, copperplate. The author is one Absalom Gray, a clerk and land agent. The entries begin in the autumn of 1842. October 15, 1842. It is with a profound sense of foreboding that I take up my pen to record the events which have led me to this godforsaken place. My name is Absalom Gray. Until a fortnight ago, I was a man of ledgers and figures, employed in the respectable offices of Pynchon and Sons, land agents of London. My world was one of clean parchment and predictable sums. That world is now a distant memory, shattered by a single, peculiar commission. The firm was retained by a Mr. Silas Blackwood, the owner of a remote corn mill and associated estate in Dartmoor, Devon. The retainer was not for the purchase or sale of land, but for the most macabre of services, the documentation of a death. Specifically, the death of Mr. Blackwood's fourth wife, a Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood. The correspondence, which I was tasked to review, was sparse and unsettling. Mr. Blackwood demanded the immediate dispatch of a discreet and literate man, to inventory the deceased's effects and formalize the particulars for the probate court. The tone was not of grief, but of cold, bureaucratic urgency. There was mention of local superstition, hindering officialdom, and a need for an outsider's impartiality. Why Mr. Pynchon chose me for this grim task, I cannot say. Perhaps it was my reputation for meticulousness, or my lack of familial ties that made me expendable. The assignment was presented as a simple matter of weeks, with a generous bonus for the hardship of travel to so desolate a corner of England. And so, I find myself in the market town of Tavistock, preparing for the final leg of my journey to the hamlet of Gormley and the dreaded Blackwood Mill itself. The journey from London was a gradual descent into wilderness. The ordered fields of the home counties gave way to the wild, rolling hills of Devon, and these, in turn, hardened into the bleak, granite-strewn expanse of Dartmoor. The coach rattled over roads that were little more than goat tracks, the wind howling with a voice that seemed to carry ancient malice. At Tavistock, I was forced to hire a dog-cart driven by a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that held a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders. When I told him my destination, he spat onto the muddy ground. "Blackwood Mill," he grunted, shaking his head. "You're the London man, then? Sent to tidy up after the last one." "The last one?" I inquired, my professional curiosity piqued. "The wife," he said, his voice dropping. "The fourth. So there's or jumped. Or was pushed." He gave a harsh, humorless laugh. "Old Silas, he has a hunger the moor can't satisfy. It eats his sheep, his crops, and his women. Mark my words, sir, that mill grinds more than just corn." He would say no more, despite my attempts to press him. The rest of the journey passed in a damp, chilly silence. We forded peat-brown streams and passed standing stones that jutted from the earth like rotten teeth. The sky was a leaden sheet, and a fine, persistent rain began to fall, reducing the world to shades of gray and green. And then I saw it. The Blackwood Mill. It stood in a shallow valley, a hulking structure of dark stone, its water wheel still and skeletal against the rushing torrent of the mill race. The mill house, a two-story building of the same grim granite, was attached directly to the works, its windows like sightless eyes. The whole estate was shrouded in a pall of mist and isolation. It was not merely a building, it was a fortress against the elements, and it radiated a sense of profound, unwelcoming solitude. The dog-cart deposited me and my trunk at the stone bridge leading to the mill yard. The driver took his coin and turned his horse with a haste that bordered on panic, disappearing back into the mist without a backward glance. I was alone. The only sounds were the relentless rush of water and the mournful cry of a crow perched on the mill roof. As I stood there, a figure emerged from the mill house door. A tall, gaunt man, silhouetted against the firelight within. He did not call out a greeting. He simply stood and watched me, his arms crossed. This, I knew with a cold certainty, was Silas Blackwood. And in that moment, as the Dartmoor rain soaked through my greatcoat, I felt the first icy finger of dread trace its way down my spine. This was not a simple matter of probate. I had been sent to catalogue the aftermath of a tragedy, but I feared I was stepping into the lair of something far darker. The mill by the Blackwater was waiting, and it had already consumed 4 women. I felt, with the irrational conviction of a nightmare, that it was now turning its hunger upon me. The figure standing in the doorway did not move to assist me with my trunk, nor did he offer any word of welcome. He remained a stark, unmoving silhouette, forcing me to navigate the slippery, uneven cobbles of the mill yard alone, hauling my belongings through the clinging Dartmoor drizzle. With each step, the sense of isolation deepened, the roaring of the mill race becoming a constant, oppressive thunder that vibrated through the very stones beneath my feet. The mill itself loomed above me, its dark granite walls streaked with greenish moss and what looked disturbingly like rust-colored stains spreading from the foundation upwards, as if the very earth were bleeding onto the stone. As I drew nearer, the details of the man's face became visible in the dim light escaping from the doorway. Silas Blackwood was a man in his late 50s, but the harsh moorland life had carved decades more onto his visage. His face was all sharp angles and deep furrows, his skin leathered by wind and weather. His hair, a thick, iron-gray mane, was swept back from a high forehead. But it was his eyes that held me captive, a pale, piercing blue. They held no warmth, only a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to look straight through my city clothes and into the core of my unease. He was dressed in practical, worn garments of coarse wool and heavy boots, a man who looked as much a part of this grim landscape as the granite tors themselves. "Gray?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that competed with the water's roar. It was not a question so much as a statement, an acknowledgement of a necessary, but unwelcome, arrival. "I am Sir Absalom Gray, of Pynchon and Sons," I replied, striving to maintain a professional tone despite my discomfort. "I have come regarding the unfortunate matter of your late wife." A flicker of something, impatience? Annoyance, crossed his features. "The matter?" He turned abruptly. "Come inside. The damp does no good to man nor ledger." He led me into the mill house. The interior was a shock after the bleak exterior. It was not the rough-hewn dwelling of a simple miller I had expected, but a space of surprising, if grim, substance. The main room was a combination of kitchen and parlor, dominated by a massive hearth where a peat fire smoldered, filling the air with a sweet, earthy smell that did little to dispel the pervasive chill. The furniture was heavy, dark oak, solid and old. Books lined shelves built into the stone walls, their leather bindings cracked with age. There were no feminine touches, no curtains or samplers, nothing to suggest a woman had ever lived here. It was the home of a solitary, cerebral man, a fortress of the mind as much as of stone. "Mrs. Higgs will see to your quarters," Blackwood said, gesturing to a doorway that led, I presumed, to the rest of the house. "She comes from the village days. Prepares a meal. You'll take supper with me at 7. We can discuss your business then." Before I could respond, a woman emerged from the shadows of a corridor. She was small and wiry, perhaps 60 years of age, with a face like a wrinkled apple and eyes that darted everywhere but never quite met mine. She bobbed a curtsy, her hands clutching at her apron. "This is Mr. Gray, from London, Mrs. Higgs," Blackwood said. "Show him to the north room. See he has what he needs." "Aye, Master Blackwood," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the fire's crackle. She scurried forward and took the handle of my trunk with a surprising strength, leading me up a narrow, twisting staircase of worn stone. The room she showed me to was in the part of the house farthest from the mill's workings, yet the vibration of the water was still a constant, physical presence. It was sparsely furnished, a bed with a thick woolen blanket, a washstand, a small writing desk, and a single chair. A lone window looked out not towards the moor, but into the deep, churning channel of the mill race itself, the water a foaming, angry torrent just feet below the thick glass. The view was dizzying, hypnotic in its relentless power. "Will there be anything else, sir?" Mrs. Higgs asked, hovering by the door. "Thank you, no," I said. "Tell me, Mrs. Higgs, how long did you know the late Mrs. Blackwood?" The woman flinched as if struck. Her eyes widened in genuine fear. I minded my place, sir. I did the cooking and the cleaning. That's all. She backed out of the room, pulling the door shut with a finality that felt like a warning. Left alone, I unpacked my writing materials, setting them on the desk with a sense of grim purpose. The mystery of this place was deepening. The master of the house was a cold, intimidating figure, and the only servant was a frightened mouse of a woman. And everywhere, the sound of water, a sound that was beginning to feel less like a natural force and more like a living, breathing entity that surrounded and permeated the very foundations of the mill. That evening, supper was a silent, tense affair. The food, a stew of mutton and root vegetables, was well prepared, but eaten under Silas Blackwood's unblinking gaze. It turned to ash in my mouth. He asked me no questions about London, about my journey, or about myself. He only stared as if taking my measure. Finally, as Mrs. Higgs cleared the plates, he spoke. The particulars are simple, grey. Elara took a fall. From the top of the mill, onto the stones by the race. The local constable, a superstitious fool, was satisfied. The villagers, however, are not. There is talk. Foolish talk. Your task is to document her possessions, her few letters, her existence here. Create a record for the court that will silence the whispers. You are a man of facts, are you not? I am, sir, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Good, he said, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. Then stick to your facts. The moor breeds fancies. Do not listen to them. The mill has its own sounds. Pay them no mind. He rose from the table. We begin in the morning. Her things are in the upper room. The one she preferred. He left me then, retreating into a study off the main parlor and closing the door firmly behind him. I was left alone in the firelight, the roar of the water my only companion. His words had been a clear boundary, a warning. But they had the opposite effect of what he intended. For in dismissing the whispers, he had given them substance. And in mentioning the sounds of the mill, he had made me acutely aware of them. Beneath the constant thunder of the water, I could now hear other things, the groan of ancient timbers, the creak of the great wheel, and faintly, so faintly it might have been the wind, what sounded like a woman's sigh. I knew then, with a certainty that froze my blood, that Silas Blackwood was lying. And I was trapped in his house of lies, with the dark water roaring beneath my window, eager to swallow the truth whole. The night passed in a fitful succession of starts and awakenings. The unceasing roar of the mill race outside my window was a physical presence in the room, a constant vibration that seemed to seep up from the stone floor and into my bones. Every groan of the old house, every rattle of the window pane in the moorland wind, jolted me from shallow sleep. My dreams were fragmented and dark, filled with images of falling water and a woman's pale, pleading face glimpsed for an instant before being swallowed by the foam. When the weak, gray light of a Dartmoor dawn finally filtered through the window, I rose feeling more exhausted than when I had retired. Mrs. Higgs provided a silent breakfast of porridge and strong tea. Silas Blackwood was absent, and the woman's nervousness was even more pronounced than the previous evening. She moved about the kitchen like a phantom, her movements quick and furtive. I attempted to engage her in conversation once more, asking a simple question about the weather patterns on the moor. The weather, sir? She repeated, her eyes darting towards the window. It has its own mind, the moor does. Some days it's quiet as a lamb. Others it screams. She clutched the cross that hung from a chain around her neck. It knows things. It remembers. Before I could press her further, she scurried back into the scullery, leaving me alone with the oppressive silence of the house, broken only by the eternal thunder of the water. True to his word, Blackwood appeared after breakfast, his manner brusque and businesslike. He led me up another flight of stairs, narrower and steeper than the last, to the very top of the house. This was her room, he said, unlocking a heavy oak door with a key from his chain. She preferred the view. Such as it is. He pushed the door open but did not enter. You will find her chest at the foot of the bed. Her personal effects. Do what you must. I have business at the mill. He left me standing on the threshold. The room was a stark contrast to the rest of the house. Where Blackwood's domain was dominated by dark wood and masculine solidity, this room was light, or had been. The walls were painted a pale, faded yellow, and a large window, now streaked with grime, looked out over the moors. But it was a view of desolation, endless expanses of peat bog and granite, under a sky the color of lead. The room itself was cold and smelled of dust and disuse. In the center stood a simple bed, and at its foot, a small wooden traveling chest, banded with iron. With a deep breath, I stepped inside and closed the door. The sound of the mill was slightly muted here, a distant, rhythmic pounding. I approached the chest. It was not locked. Kneeling on the cold floorboards, I lifted the lid. The scent of dried lavender and camphor rose to meet me, a ghost of domesticity in this grim place. The inventory began mechanically, a comfort in its familiarity. I listed dresses of practical wool and one finer gown of dark green silk, likely unworn on the moor. There were shifts, stockings, a pair of sturdy boots. A small jewelry box contained only a simple silver locket. I opened it. Inside was a miniature portrait, not of Silas Blackwood, but of a young man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. I stared at it, a puzzle piece that did not fit. Who was this? A brother? A lost love? I set it aside carefully. Beneath the clothing I found a portfolio of drawings. Eleanor Blackwood had been an artist of considerable talent. The pages were filled with sketches of the moor, but they were not the picturesque landscapes of a tourist. They captured the bleak, powerful beauty of the place, the twisted, wind-sculpted trees, the brooding tors, the play of storm light over the peat bogs. But interspersed with these were darker images. Detailed studies of the mill's machinery, the great grinding stones, the intricate gears, the water wheel itself. These drawings were not merely observational. They were obsessive, the lines dark and heavy, as if drawn with a furious intensity. One sketch, in particular, made my blood run cold. It was a study of the mill race from my own window's perspective, but in the foaming water, she had drawn a face, a woman's face, her features contorted in a silent scream, her hair flowing like weed in the current. At the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, I found a small, leather-bound journal. My hands trembled as I opened it. The handwriting was elegant and flowing, but the entries were sporadic, often just a few lines. The early pages spoke of isolation and a growing fear. October 1841, the mill's voice is constant. It speaks to him. He stands for hours, listening to the stones grind. He says it is the sound of order, of purpose. To me, it sounds like teeth. November 1841. I showed him my drawing of the wheel. He was not pleased. He said I should not draw what I do not understand. He fears the mill's secrets. December 1841. He speaks of the others sometimes in his cups. Clara, Agnes, Mary. Their names are like ghosts in this house. He says they were weak, that they could not bear the mill's strength. What strength does he mean? January 1842. I found a lock of hair, blonde, tucked behind a ledger in his study. It was not mine. I am the fourth. How long will the mill be satisfied? The final entry was dated the day before her death. The writing was hurried, the ink blotted as if by tears. He says I must learn the mill's heart. He wants to show me the grinding stones at night, when the moon is full. He says it is a baptism. Mrs. Higgs warned me not to go. She says the water claims what he offers it. God help me. I closed the journal, my heart hammering. This was no simple accident. Eleanor Blackwood had been terrified. She believed her husband was complicit with some malevolent force within the mill, a force that had claimed his previous wives. The baptism he planned for her was her death sentence. I was not here to tidy up a tragedy, I was here to whitewash a murder. The facts in my ledger were pointing to a horror far greater than any village superstition. I had come to document a death, and I had stumbled upon a pattern of sacrifice. And as I sat there in the silent, cold room, I realized with dawning terror that by uncovering this truth, I had likely made myself the next offering on the mill's dark altar. The discovery of Eleanor Blackwood's journal left me sitting on the cold floorboards of that attic room for what felt like an eternity, the small leather-bound book feeling like a live coal in my hands. The professional detachment I had carried from London lay in shattered ruins around me. This was no longer a matter of probate and inventory. It was a chronicle of terror, a whispered confession from beyond the grave that implicated my employer in something monstrous. The words, "The water claims what he offers it," echoed in my mind, mingling with the relentless roar of the mill race below, until the two sounds became indistinguishable, a constant, accusing litany. A sudden, heavy footfall on the stair outside jolted me from my paralysis. With a speed born of pure instinct, I shoved the journal deep into the inner pocket of my waistcoat, rearranging the contents of the chest to hide the void it left. The door creaked open just as I closed the lid, affecting an air of studious concentration as I made a note in my ledger. Silas Blackwood filled the doorway, his frame blocking what little light came from the corridor. His pale eyes swept the room, lingering on the open chest before fixing on me. "You have been at it some time, Mr. Gray," he observed, his voice flat. "I trust you are finding everything in order?" "The inventory proceeds, Mr. Blackwood," I replied, hoping the tremor in my voice would be mistaken for cold. "A tragic business. She seems to have been a woman of some refinement." I gestured vaguely towards the portfolio of drawings, which I had left on top of the chest. He stepped fully into the room, his presence making the small space feel claustrophobic. He picked up the portfolio and flipped through the pages with thick, calloused fingers. A muscle twitched in his jaw when he reached the drawing of the face in the mill race. He did not comment on it, but closed the portfolio with a sharp snap. "Fancies," he said, tossing it back into the chest. "The more fills women's heads with fancies. A dangerous thing. My Elara was given to an overactive imagination. It led her to places she should not have gone." The threat in his words was veiled but unmistakable. He was warning me. He knew what was in those drawings, and he knew what I might infer from them. "Indeed, sir," I said, forcing a neutral tone. "A tragic accident." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if probing the sincerity of my statement. "Quite." The constable was satisfied. "Let that be an end to it." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "The weather is turning. A storm comes in from the coast. You will dine in your room tonight, Mr. Gray. Mrs. Higgs will bring a tray. The moor is no place to be abroad after dark, even within these walls." The door closed behind him, and I heard the key turn in the lock. I was a prisoner in the dead woman's room. The pretext was the storm, but the reality was a cage. He was isolating me, controlling my movements. The journal in my pocket seemed to burn against my chest, a secret that now felt less like evidence and more like a death warrant. Hours dragged by. The promised storm arrived with violent fury. Rain lashed against the window pane, and the wind howled around the corners of the mill with a sound like a banshee's wail. The roar of the water swelled to a deafening crescendo, a constant, pounding reminder of the power that Silas Blackwood commanded and the fate that had befallen Elara. In the tempest, other sounds seemed to emerge, a high, thin crying that might have been the wind whistling through a crack, but which raised the hairs on my neck, a rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across the stones of the yard below. When Mrs. Higgs finally arrived with my supper tray, her face was ashen, her hands shaking so violently the crockery rattled. She would not meet my eyes. "Mrs. Higgs," I said quietly as she set the tray down on the small desk. "The journal. Elara's journal. She wrote that you warned her." The woman froze, her back to me. For a long moment, the only sounds were the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. "She was a good girl," Mrs. Higgs whispered, so low I barely heard her. "The third one, Mary, she was a good girl too. And Agnes before her. And poor Clara, the first." She turned, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it was pitiable. "He doesn't mean to be what he is, sir. The mill, it changes a man. It gives him a hunger for order, for control. And it demands a price for the grain it grinds." "A price?" I urged, my voice barely a breath. "The water must be fed," she said, her gaze darting towards the window and the churning race below. "It gets restless. It whispers to him in the night. And when it whispers too loud." She trailed off, clutching her cross again. "He's listening to it now. Can't you hear? It's singing to him. It's hungry again. Before I could ask another question, she fled, pulling the door shut behind her. I heard the key turn once more. I was left alone with my cold supper and the terrifying confirmation of my worst fears. Silas Blackwood was not merely a murderer, he was a high priest of a dark, elemental cult, and the mill was his altar. The deaths of his wives were not crimes of passion, but ritual sacrifices to appease the hungry spirit of the water. And Mrs. Higgs's words, "It's hungry again," echoed in the dark room. The storm was not just a weather event, it was a manifestation of the mill's appetite. And I, the outsider, the man with the ledger, had been brought here not just to cover up the last sacrifice, but to potentially become the next. The ledger of Absalom Gray was no longer a simple account of assets. It was becoming a testament of accusation, and I feared it would be the last thing I ever wrote. The lock turning in the door behind Mrs. Higgs felt like the ceiling of my tomb. The tray of food sat untouched on the desk, the mutton stew congealing into a greasy mass, the scent of it turning my stomach. The storm outside was not abating. It was building into a symphony of elemental fury. Each thunderclap was a percussive blast that shook the very stones of the mill, and the wind screamed with a voice that seemed almost articulate in its rage. But it was the water that truly terrified me. The mill race, usually a powerful but contained torrent, now sounded like a raging beast trying to tear its way through the foundations. The constant roar had deepened into a basso profundo growl, punctuated by violent crashes as debris, or something else, was dashed against the stone walls. Mrs. Higgs's words, "It's hungry again," coiled in my mind like a venomous serpent. I was a rational man, a clerk of facts and figures. Yet, in that locked room, surrounded by the artifacts of a dead woman and buffeted by a storm that felt personally vengeful, rationality was a thin parchment shield against a deluge of nightmare. I pulled Ilara's journal from my pocket, not to read it again, but for the tangible connection it provided to another human soul who had felt this same terror. The delicate book felt like my only ally in a world gone mad. Driven by a desperate need to see, to understand the source of the cacophony, I went to the window. Wiping away the condensation with my sleeve, I pressed my face against the cold glass. The view was a vision of hell. The moon was entirely obscured, but frequent flashes of lightning illuminated the scene in stark, terrifying tableaus. The mill pond, usually a dark but placid sheet, was a seething cauldron of white water. The mill wheel, typically stationary at night, was now turning with a jerky, frantic motion, driven by the overwhelming force of the flood. It was as if a giant, invisible hand were spinning it for some malevolent purpose. And then I saw him. Silas Blackwood. A flash of lightning revealed his tall, gaunt figure standing on the narrow wooden platform that ran alongside the racing millstream. He was not seeking shelter. He stood facing the torrent, his arms raised slightly from his sides, his head thrown back. His oilskin coat whipped around him in the gale, but he himself was a statue of defiance, or perhaps invocation. He was not fighting the storm, he was communing with it. Another lightning burst, closer this time, and I saw his face. It was not contorted in fear or effort, but bore an expression of ecstatic reverence, a terrifying rapture as he absorbed the fury of the elements. He was listening to the symphony, and he was its conductor. As I watched, frozen with a mixture of horror and fascination, a great, dark shape was carried down the race towards the wheel. It was a large tree trunk, torn from its banks upstream. The water seized it and slammed it into the spinning wheel with a sickening crunch of splintering wood. The impact jarred the entire structure, and for a moment, the wheel shuddered and groaned, threatening to tear itself apart. Blackwood didn't flinch. He took a step closer to the edge, leaning towards the chaos as if urging it on. It was then that I saw them, or thought I saw them. In the churning, foam-flecked water, illuminated for a split second by a particularly brilliant fork of lightning, I saw faces. Not just one, but several. Pale, indistinct, their features blurred by the violent motion, but unmistakably human. They swirled in the current, their mouths open in silent screams, their hair streaming like weed. They were there for a heartbeat, a phantom gallery of the lost, and then the light died, and they were gone, swallowed by the darkness and the foam. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. Was it a trick of the light? The product of my own terror-fed imagination? Or had I just witnessed the spirits of the mill's victims, churning eternally in the water that had taken them? The sound of the lock turning again made me jump. The door opened to reveal Silas Blackwood himself. Water streamed from his oilskins, forming a puddle on the floorboards. His face was flushed, his eyes blazing with an unnerving vitality. He smelled of peat, rain, and something else, a metallic, ozonic scent like the air after a lightning strike. "The storm speaks with a pure voice tonight, Gray," he said, his tone strangely conversational, as if we were discussing the price of grain. "It scours away the weak. It reveals the true strength of stone and water." His gaze fell upon the tray of untouched food. "You do not eat. The Moor's passion has stolen your appetite." It was not a question. "I was occupied with my work, sir," I stammered, clutching the ledger to my chest like a child's blanket. He smiled, a thin, cold stretching of the lips that held no warmth. "Work. The accounting of things. But some things cannot be entered in a ledger, can they? Some forces defy your columns and sums." He took a step into the room, and the space seemed to shrink. "You look pale, man. The Moor does not agree with you. Perhaps your work here is nearing its end." The threat was now overt. My time was running out. The storm had been a catalyst, and the mill's hunger, once a whispered suspicion, was now a palpable presence in the room. I was no longer just a chronicler of past sins. I had become a witness to an ongoing sacrament of power, and Silas Blackwood could not allow me to leave. The ledger in my hands felt impossibly heavy. It was no longer just a record of Eleanor Blackwood's life. It was becoming the story of my own impending death. The symphony of the storm was reaching its crescendo, and I was trapped inside the instrument. The storm broke near dawn, not with a gradual lessening, but with an abrupt silence that was, in its own way, as unnerving as the cacophony. One moment, the world was a maelstrom of wind and water. The next, an eerie, oppressive quiet descended, broken only by the drip-drip-drip of rainwater from the eaves and the now subdued, though still powerful, rush of the mill race. The sudden absence of noise felt like a held breath, a pause in the violence that promised no peace, only a temporary respite. Silas Blackwood had left me locked in the room, his final words hanging in the air like a sentence of death. My mind, frayed by terror and sleeplessness, raced through desperate plans of escape, each more futile than the last. The window was a sheer drop onto the jagged stones of the mill race. The door was solid oak, bolted from the outside. As the gray light of morning strengthened, I heard the key turn in the lock once more. It was Mrs. Higgs, her face a mask of exhaustion and fresh fear. She carried a tray with a pot of tea and a slice of bread. Her hands shook so violently that the teacup rattled against its saucer. "He's gone down to the village," she whispered, her eyes darting down the empty corridor. "To see about damage from the storm. You have a little time." "Mrs. Higgs, you must help me," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "I know what he is. I know what happened to Alara, to the others. You have to unlock a door, a window, anything." She shook her head, a frantic, bird-like motion. "There's no leaving, sir. Not when the mill has noticed you. It has its own ways. It sees through his eyes, hears through his ears. If I helped you, it would know. It would take me too." She looked at me with a pity that was worse than any threat. "Finish your work, sir. Finish it quick. The quicker it's done, the sooner you might leave." The hesitation before the word leave was telling. She did not believe I would leave alive. "Then tell me," I insisted, grabbing her arm gently. "Tell me what I am facing. What is this thing in the mill?" She sagged against the doorframe, her resistance crumbling. "It was here long before the mill, sir. Long before any of us. The old people knew. They called it the spirit of the Blackwater. A hungry thing, a cold thing. To gives, but it must take. The first miller, Blackwood's grandfather, he made a bargain. The mill would never want for grain, the wheel would never stop turning, but the water must be fed. Preferred the warmth of it. The wives," I breathed, the horror crystallizing into a dreadful, logical pattern. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. The first one, Clara, it was an accident, they said. She fell. But the mill ran sweeter after. The grain was finer. Then Agnes. She took a fever, but the doctor said it was a strange fever, a cold fever. And the mill thrived through a drought. He learned then. He understood the bargain. Mary, the third, she was offered. After a poor harvest. He took her to see the grinding stones at night. She was always a curious one. Mrs. Higgs wiped her eyes with a corner of her apron. And Alara. The storm was coming. The water was getting restless. He said it needed a strong one, a vibrant one, to see it through the winter. A cold fury began to mix with my fear. This was not madness. It was a calculated, ongoing evil. Silas Blackwood was a farmer, and his wives were his livestock, sacrificed to ensure a good yield from his dark, aquatic patron. Where? I asked. Where did it happen? Her voice dropped to the faintest whisper. In the grinding room. There's a stone channel that leads the water away. It's deep there. Very deep. Sometimes I think I can hear them, down in the dark, still turning with the wheel. She fled then, leaving the tray behind. I did not touch the tea. Her confession had painted a picture so vile it had stripped me of all mundane needs. I was a prisoner in a functioning slaughterhouse, and the butcher would soon return. Driven by a desperate, morbid need for confirmation, I did something reckless. I left the room and crept down the stairs. The house was silent. I moved past the parlor and into the cold, cavernous space of the mill itself. The air was thick with the smell of damp stone, old wood, and a peculiar, metallic dust. The great grinding stones, each taller than a man, stood silent in the dim light filtering through high, grimy windows. The power of the water was transmitted through a complex system of gears and shafts, a masterpiece of engineering devoted to a horrific purpose. And then I saw it. Near the base of the primary grinding stone, just as Mrs. Higgs had said, was a dark, stone-lined channel where water churned away into the depths below the mill. The opening was about 3 feet wide, a gaping maw of black water. As I stood there, hypnotized by the vortex, I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable beneath the water's roar. A sound like whispering. Not one voice, but several, layered over one another. A sibilant, desperate chorus. I could not make out words, but the tone was clear, an eternal, hopeless lament. It was the whispering of the walls, the voices of the sacrificed, trapped in the mill's endless cycle. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway, back from the village sooner than expected. He was not surprised to see me. His expression was one of cold satisfaction. "Curious, Mr. Gray," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I see you have found the heart of the mill. It speaks to you, does it not? It has a voice that calls to those with an ear for truth." He took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the dark channel. "It is showing you your place in the order of things." I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The whispering from the water seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was no longer a lament. It was a greeting. They were welcoming a new voice to their chorus. The ledger, my facts, my rationality, they were useless here. I was in the belly of the beast, and it was time to settle accounts. Silas Blackwood's advance was not rushed or aggressive. It was the slow, inevitable creep of a predator who knows its prey is cornered. Each footfall on the sawdust-strewn floor echoed in the cavernous grinding room, a death knell measured in seconds. The whispering from the dark water channel seemed to swell in anticipation, a sibilant chorus urging him on. I backed away until the cold, damp stone of the wall pressed against my back. There was no escape. The ledger I clutched was a pathetic shield against the reality before me. "You think me a monster, Gray," Blackwood said, his voice calm, almost conversational, yet it carried over the din of the water. "You see a simple equation. A man kills his wives. But you are a man of accounts. You, of all people, should understand the principle of balance, of debt and payment." He stopped a few yards away, his pale eyes gleaming in the half-light. He spread his hands, indicating the mill around us. "This place, It is more than stone and wood. It is a nexus. A place where the veil between worlds is thin. The water that turns this will comes from deep within the moor, from places older than mankind. Carries a consciousness. A hunger. My grandfather recognized it. He didn't build this mill despite the Blackwater spirit, he built it because of it. My mind reeled. He was speaking not like a madman, but like a businessman explaining a shrewd investment. The horror was in his cold, pragmatic rationality. The spirit gives, he continued, a fanatical light kindling in his gaze. It gives abundance. Through drought and flood, blight and famine, Blackwood Mill has never failed. The grain is always plentiful, the flour the finest in Devon. But everything has a cost. The spirit feeds on vitality, on the essence of life. It requires a sacrament. His eyes flickered towards the churning channel. A willing sacrifice strengthens the bond. It is a transaction, Gray. The purest form of commerce. Willing. I spat, finding my voice at last, a thin, reedy sound against the mill's roar. Ilara was terrified. Her journal. Ilara was weak, he snapped, his composure cracking for an instant to reveal the fervent fanatic beneath. She did not understand the honor. The others, they came to see. Clara was initially reluctant, but she accepted her role. Agnes embraced it. Mary was the most devout of all. She walked into the water with a smile, knowing she would become part of something eternal, something greater than herself. He was breathing heavily now, a zealot transfixed by his own dark gospel. They are not gone, clerk. They are transformed. Their energy fuels the wheel. Their voices sing in the water. They are the mill, and the mill is them. I understood then the full depth of his depravity. It wasn't just murder, it was a warped theology. He had convinced himself, and perhaps his victims, that this was a holy rite. He was a priest offering sacrifices to a pagan god of water and grain, and he saw himself as the benevolent steward of a terrible, necessary covenant. And me? I asked, my voice trembling. Am I to be the next sacrament? To balance the ledgers? A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. You are an anomaly, Gray. A loose end. Your neat little inventory was meant to close the book on Ilara, to silence the gossips. But you peered too deeply. You opened the ledger of the damned. And now, he took a final step forward, his hand reaching not for me, but towards the iron lever that controlled the flow of water to the grinding stones. Now you must be entered into the accounts. He gripped the lever. The whispering from the channel rose to a crescendo, becoming a cacophony of eager, hungry voices. I saw them then clearly, as if the veil had truly been torn. Pale, shifting faces in the foam, the faces of Clara, Agnes, Mary, and Ilara, their features etched with a terrible, merged consciousness, eager for a new soul to join their eternal servitude. This was the moment the storm had heralded. This was the hunger Mrs. Higgs had feared. The ledger fell from my numb fingers, scattering its pages of neat script across the filthy floor. The facts and figures were meaningless here. I was about to become a footnote in Silas Blackwood's bloody balance sheet, another entry in the chronicle of the mill, my life force ground to dust between the stones just like the grain. There was no prayer left in me, only a final, stark realization. I had come to document a death, and I was about to become the subject of my own final report. The moment stretched into an eternity, each second marked by the frantic beating of my heart and the eager, whispering susurrus from the dark water. Silas Blackwood's hand rested on the great iron lever, his knuckles white with tension. The fanatical light in his eyes burned with the intensity of a man about to complete a sacred rite. I was pinned against the cold stone wall, not by physical force, but by the sheer, overwhelming weight of the horror that had been revealed to me. My life, my rational world of ledgers and logic, had narrowed to this single point, the pull of a lever that would release the full, destructive force of the mill race into this room, sweeping me into the grinding mechanism or down into the lightless channel to join the chorus of the lost. But as I stared into the face of my death, a strange clarity descended upon me. The terror was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was joined by a sharp, calculating instinct for survival. Blackwood saw himself as a high priest, a master of accounts. Perhaps that was the key. He understood the language of transaction, of value. I had nothing to offer but my life, but perhaps there was another currency. Wait! I cried out, my voice cutting through the whispers and the water's roar. Blackwood's hand paused. He did not release the lever, but his head tilted, a flicker of curiosity in his predatory gaze. You have last words, clerk? A prayer for your God, who has no dominion here. Not a prayer, I said, forcing a steadiness into my voice I did not feel. I gestured with a trembling hand at the scattered pages of my ledger on the floor. A proposition. A new entry for your accounts. A faint, cruel smile touched his lips. You have nothing to bargain with, Gray. Your life is a debt about to be called in. Is it? I countered, taking a half-step forward, my mind racing. You speak of balance. Of transactions. You sacrificed your wives to ensure the mill's prosperity. But what happens when the outside world intervenes? My firm, Pynchon & Sons, knows I am here. If I vanish, they will send others. The constable from Tavistock, however superstitious, will be forced to act if a London agent disappears. There will be questions, investigations. They may not believe in your spirit, but they will believe in murder. Your balance will be shattered. The mill could be seized, shut down. Your covenant would be broken. I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. I had struck a nerve. His power was absolute here, in this isolated valley, but it was fragile against the inexorable machinery of the law and modern society. He relied on silence and superstition to cloak his deeds. I am a loose end, I pressed on, but killing me creates a larger one. A frayed thread that could unravel everything you have built. And what is your alternative? He asked, his voice a low growl. You think I will let you walk out of here to tell your tale? No, I admitted, the word tasting like ash. I know you cannot. But my death need not be a liability. It can be an asset. The idea forming in my mind was so monstrous I could scarcely believe I was giving it voice. You said the spirit prefers a willing sacrifice. One that strengthens the bond. My death now, in fear and resistance, what power would that hold? But if I were to understand, if I were to accept the necessity, would that not be of greater value? I was playing a desperate game, appealing to his warped sense of theology. I was offering him not just a life, but a conversion. The ultimate balancing of the books, the skeptic made believer, his death transformed from a messy cover-up into a potent ritual. Blackwood was silent for a long time, studying me. The whispers from the channel seemed to quieten, as if the entity itself was listening, considering my proposal. The entire mill seemed to hold its breath. You are clever, clerk, he said finally, a note of grudging respect in his tone. You think like a merchant even at the brink. You would bargain for the quality of your own soul's passage. He released the lever slowly. An unwilling sacrifice is merely fuel. A willing one is a communion. The spirit would find it sweet. He took a step back, granting me a reprieve, but the cage was still firmly locked. I had not won my freedom. I had merely negotiated the terms of my imprisonment and eventual execution. I had bought time, but at what cost? I had to feign an acceptance of his vile creed, to pretend a willingness to be sacrificed to this ancient horror. It was a blasphemy that sickened me to my core, but it was the only card I had to play. You will have until the next full moon, Blackwood declared, his decision made. 3 days hence. Use that time to prepare your accounts. To understand the great work you will be joining. Mrs. Higgs will bring you what you need. Do not attempt to leave. The Moor will not allow it. The spirit already knows your scent. He turned and walked out of the grinding room, leaving me alone amidst the groaning timbers and the now subdued whispers. I slid down the wall onto the damp floor, my body trembling uncontrollably. I had survived the immediate threat, but I had sold a part of my soul in the process. I was now a participant in my own damnation, a prisoner awaiting a ritualized death. The ledger pages around me were no longer just records of the dead, they were the framework for my own final entry. I had 3 days to find a way out of a bargain made with the devil of the Blackwater, A bargain I myself had proposed to save my life. The 3 days of my reprieve stretched before me like a death sentence pronounced in slow, excruciating increments. I was returned to the north room, but the lock on the door was no longer necessary. Blackwood's warning, "The more will not allow it. The spirit already knows your scent," was a more effective prison than any iron bolt. The very atmosphere of the valley had changed. Where before the isolation had been profound, it now felt actively malevolent. The wind that swept down from the tors seemed to carry whispers that were not of air through heather, but of voices murmuring my name. The constant roar of the mill race was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a rhythmic, breathing entity that watched the house with a liquid, patient hunger. Mrs. Higgs brought my meals, but she was a ghost of her already timid self. She would place the tray down without a word, her eyes red-rimmed and downcast, and flee as if my very presence contaminated the air. I tried once more to appeal to her, to plant some seed of rebellion, but she shook her head violently. "It's too late, sir," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You've spoken the words. You've made the bargain. There's no undoing it now. The water heard you." She left me with the chilling certainty that my desperate ploy had been more than just a performance for Blackwood. It had been a genuine ritual utterance that had bound me to the mill's dark fate. Left alone with my thoughts, I became an archaeologist of my own impending doom. I paced the small room, my mind a frantic pendulum swinging between abject terror and desperate, calculating strategy. I had 3 days. 72 hours to unravel a mystery that had ensnared and destroyed 4 women before me. My only tools were my wits and the damning evidence I already possessed. Ilara's journal, tucked safely inside my waistcoat. I read and reread it until the pages were soft from handling, searching for some clue I had missed, some weakness in Blackwood's armor or the spirit's dominion. Her words about the baptism at the grinding stones on the night of a full moon haunted me. That was to be my fate. But she had also written of the mill's secrets, of things Blackwood feared. He says I should not draw what I do not understand. He fears the mill's secrets. What secrets? The mechanical workings were plain enough, however impressive. What hidden vulnerability did this ancient entity possess? On the 2nd day, as the moon began to wax fat and luminous in the slate-gray sky, I made a decision. If I was to die, I would not go as a willing lamb to the slaughter, no matter what fiction I had sold Blackwood. I would go down fighting, and I would take every scrap of knowledge with me to the grave, in the hope that some future investigator might piece it together. I resumed my work on the inventory with a feverish intensity, but it was now a camouflage. I requested more ink and paper from Mrs. Higgs, claiming I needed to make a fair copy for the probate court. What I truly began was a second, secret ledger. In this new document, written in a minute, coded script I devised, I recorded everything. I described Blackwood's confession in the grinding room, detailing his warped theology of sacrifice. I transcribed the most damning passages from Ilara's journal. I documented Mrs. Higgs's terrified hints and the changing behavior of the natural world around the mill. I drew a detailed map of the mill's interior, marking the grinding room and the deadly channel. This was no longer Absalom Gray, the dispassionate clerk. This was Absalom Gray, the chronicler of a great evil, writing a testament meant for a world that would likely never see it. The act of writing became a strange sort of therapy. The focus required to encode my thoughts, to choose my words with precision, forced a temporary calm upon my terror. I was doing something. I was bearing witness. And in the meticulous process, a new thought began to form, a wild, desperate theory. Blackwood's power was tied to the mill, to the water wheel, to the very machinery of the place. The spirit was bound to this specific location, this specific flow of water. What if the connection could be broken? Not by faith or prayer, but by mechanics? What if the mill itself could be sabotaged? The idea was madness. I was no engineer. But as I studied my own map, I noted the system of levers and gates that controlled the water flow. The main lever, the one Blackwood had threatened to pull, was massive, but there were smaller, secondary controls. A plan, fragile and insane, began to take shape. It was not a plan for escape, but for disruption. If I could not save myself, perhaps I could break the cycle. On the night of the full moon, during this baptism, I would not go quietly. I would turn the mill's own power against it. It was a suicidal gambit, but it was the only move left on the board. The prisoner had decided to burn down his own prison, even if he was locked inside. The final day of my reprieve dawned with a sky of bruised purple and ominous, fast-moving clouds that occasionally tore open to reveal the bloated, pale face of the nearly full moon. It was a day of unnatural stillness. The wind had died completely, and the mill race's roar seemed somehow muted, as if the water itself was gathering its strength, holding its breath in anticipation of the night's dark sacrament. The silence was more terrifying than any storm. It was the quiet of a predator coiled to strike. My nerves were stretched to their breaking point. Every creak of the old house, every footstep I heard, whether real or imagined, sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my frame. I had not slept. The secret ledger lay hidden beneath a loose floorboard, a testament written in the frantic script of a condemned man. My body was a vessel of exhaustion and fear, but my mind was preternaturally clear, sharpened by desperation into a single, focused point: the coming night. I had spent the previous day in a state of intense, clandestine observation. When Mrs. Higgs brought my meals, I noted the direction she came from, the time she spent elsewhere in the house. I listened at my door, mapping the sounds of Blackwood's movements. He was mostly in the grinding room or his study, a low, monotonous hum of activity. But in the afternoon, I heard him leave the house entirely, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel of the yard before fading into the distance. This was my chance. A reckless, potentially fatal opportunity, but the only one I might get. Waiting a few minutes to ensure he was truly gone, I slipped from my room. The house was eerily silent, the absence of the master's presence creating a vacuum. I did not go towards the front door or the mill, that would be suicide. Instead, I moved deeper into the heart of the house, towards Blackwood's private study, the room from which he governed his terrible domain. The door was unlocked. Pushing it open, I was met with a scene of ordered chaos. The room was a reflection of the man, part miller, part pagan scholar. Ledgers of grain yields and accounts were stacked neatly on one side of a massive oak desk. On the other side lay a different kind of literature, crumbling folios bound in worm-eaten leather, their pages filled not with text but with intricate, hand-drawn diagrams of spirals and vortices, and pages of dense, alchemical symbols. There were sketches of the mill's machinery, but annotated with notations that spoke of ley line convergence and essence conduits. This was no simple superstition. It was a studied, systematic occult practice passed down through generations of Blackwoods. My eyes scanned the room, searching for anything that could be a weapon or a key to the mill's weakness. And then I saw it. Tucked away on a high shelf, almost hidden behind other books, was a large, flat portfolio, much like Elara's but older, its leather cover cracked with age. With trembling hands, I pulled it down and laid it on the desk. The pages within were not drawings of the moor, but architectural plans. They were the original builder's plans for Blackwood Mill, drafted by his grandfather in a precise, spidery hand. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pored over them. They showed the foundations, the complex channeling of the water, the placement of every beam and stone. And there, clearly marked, was what I was looking for. A secondary control gate, much smaller than the main lever, located not in the grinding room itself, but in a narrow, stone-lined crawlspace that ran beneath the main floor, accessible through a hidden hatch near the base of the water wheel's mechanism. According to the notations, this gate was a failsafe, designed to divert the entire flow of water away from the wheel in case of a jam or damage. It was exactly what I needed. But as my finger traced the lines of the blueprint, I noticed something else, something that made the blood drain from my face. The plans showed that the foundation stones of the mill, particularly those surrounding the primary grinding stone and the deep channel, were not set upon solid bedrock. They were sunk into a particularly deep and unstable section of the peat bog that characterized the moor. The builder's notation here was stark. Foundation requires perpetual hydraulic pressure for stability. Diversion of primary flow risks structural collapse. The full, terrifying implication struck me like a physical blow. The mill was not just powered by the water, it was propped up by it. The constant, immense pressure of the water in the race and against the foundations was all that held the entire structure upright. If that pressure were suddenly released, the mill would not just stop, it would fall. It would tear itself apart, stone by stone, and sink into the greedy peak below. My plan for a simple diversion was now a plan for total, catastrophic destruction. I was no longer contemplating sabotage. I was considering a demolition that would bury me, Blackwood, and the entire evil history of the place in a tomb of mud and rubble. I heard the crunch of gravel on the path outside. Blackwood was returning. I had mere seconds. I carefully rolled the plans, my mind reeling. This changed everything. Could I do it? Could I knowingly bring the entire edifice down upon myself? Was death by crushing and drowning preferable to being a willing sacrifice? The thought was monstrous. But as I slipped out of the study and back to my room, the geometric certainty of the blueprint burned in my mind. The mill's greatest strength was also its ultimate weakness. The spirit was bound to the water, and the water was the only thing holding the mill together. It was a perfect, suicidal equation. The geometry of damnation offered only one solution: annihilation. The moon would rise in a few hours, and I would have to make my choice. The hours leading to moonrise were an exquisite torture. Each tick of the small clock on the mantelpiece, a sound I had never noticed before, was a hammer blow against my sanity. I attempted to eat the supper Mrs. Higgs brought, but the food was ash in my mouth. She did not meet my eyes, her movements those of an automaton fulfilling its final, dreadful programming. The tray held a larger portion than usual, and a glass of dark, rough wine. It felt like a last meal, a grotesque parody of hospitality before the execution. When she left, the silence she left behind was heavier than ever, thick with unspoken farewell. As twilight deepened, the quality of the light changed. A cold, phosphorescent glow began to permeate the room, not from the window, but seeming to emanate from the very air itself. The moon was not yet visible, but its influence was already asserting dominion over the valley. The roar of the mill race began to shift in tone. The constant, thunderous growl acquired a new, higher-pitched resonance, a keening sound that set my teeth on edge. It was no longer just the sound of moving water. It was a melody, the same haunting, discordant melody that Alara had described in her journal. The spirit was awakening, tuning its voice for the night's ritual. I took the glass of wine and poured it out the window, watching the dark liquid arc down into the churning water below. I needed a clear head, not the false courage of alcohol. My body trembled with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. I rehearsed my plan in my mind, visualizing the path from my room to the grinding room, the location of the hidden hatches shown on the ancient plans. My tools were pitiful, a small, sharp penknife from my writing set, and my own desperate will. The plan was a fragile house of cards, likely to collapse and bury me, but it was the only structure I had left to inhabit. A heavy knock sounded at my door, not the furtive tap of Mrs. Higgs, but the firm, authoritative rap of Silas Blackwood. I opened it to find him standing there, transformed. He was dressed not in his workman's clothes, but in a formal, old-fashioned suit of black broadcloth, impeccably tailored but clearly of another era. In his hand he held not a ledger, but a heavy, leather-bound book with a silver clasp, its cover embossed with the now familiar triple circle symbol. His face was serene, almost beatific, his eyes shining with a fervent light. "The time approaches, Mr. Gray," he said, his voice resonant and calm. "The moon rises and the water sings. Are you prepared to witness the truth? To understand the great work?" I forced myself to nod, my throat too constricted to speak. I had to maintain the charade of the willing acolyte until the very last moment. "Good," he said, a smile touching his lips. "Follow me." He led me down through the silent house. The atmosphere was charged, electric. The very stones of the walls seemed to hum with suppressed energy. We did not go to the main entrance, but down a narrow, winding staircase I had not seen before, a servant's passage that led directly into the vast, shadowy expanse of the grinding room. The room was illuminated not by lamps, but by the full moon's light streaming through the high, grimy windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters across the floor. The great grinding stones stood like monolithic idols in a cathedral of industry and death. The sound was overwhelming. The water's roar was a physical pressure against my eardrums, and the keening melody was now unmistakable, a chorus of voices both beautiful and terrifying. And there, by the deep, stone channel, I saw them. Not as vague impressions in the foam, but as shimmering, semi-corporeal forms. For women, their figures woven from moonlight and spray. Clara, Agnes, Mary, and Alara. They stood together, their faces not contorted in agony, but blank, serene, their eyes reflecting the cold light of the moon. They were waiting. Blackwood walked to the edge of the channel, opening his book. He began to chant in a low, guttural language I did not recognize, his words weaving into the water's song. The spectral forms of the women seemed to grow more solid at the sound. They turned their gaze towards me, and in their unified stare, I saw not malice, but a profound, empty hunger. They were the congregation, and I was the offering. This was the moment. The ritual was beginning. Blackwood was absorbed in his incantation, his back partly turned to me. My eyes scanned the floor near the great central gear mechanism, searching for the outline of the hidden hatch. A barely perceptible seam in the stone flags, almost worn away by time. It was now or never. The geometry of damnation demanded its price. I had to reach that hatch, open it, and throw the diversion gate. I would unleash not just water, but chaos. I took a deep breath, my hand closing around the penknife in my pocket. The moon's cold eye watched, impartial, as I prepared to make my move in the final, deadly game. The cacophony in the grinding room was a living entity, a wall of sound that seemed to press the very air into thick, resistant waves. Silas Blackwood's chanting rose and fell, a resonant bass counterpoint to the water's high, shrieking melody and the deep, groaning protest of the massive gears as they began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, driven by the moon-swollen torrent. The spectral forms of the four women glimmered with an intensifying light, their empty eyes fixed upon me with an anticipation that was far more terrifying than any overt threat. I was the focal point of this blasphemous liturgy, the candidate for a dark communion. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to run blindly into the moors and take my chances with the bogs and the elements. But Blackwood's warning echoed in my mind, the moor will not allow it. I was trapped within the ritual space, and my only path led not away from the horror, but deeper into its heart. My plan, conceived in the desperate quiet of my room, now seemed the pinnacle of insanity. To cross that floor, under the gaze of that madman and his ghostly brides, to find a hidden hatch and attempt an act of catastrophic sabotage, it was a suicide mission. But it was the only mission I had. I forced my limbs to move, each step an act of will against the paralyzing fear. I did not look at the chanting Blackwood or the shimmering phantoms. I fixed my gaze on the patch of stone flags near the base of the great central gear mechanism, the location burned into my memory from the stolen blueprint. The moonlight, filtering through the dusty air, seemed to conspire against me, creating a shifting chiaroscuro that made the ancient seams in the floor difficult to distinguish from shadows. The vibration of the machinery was a constant tremor rising through the soles of my boots, a physical reminder of the immense power I was attempting to challenge. I dropped to my knees, the cold, damp stones seeping through my trousers. My fingers, trembling violently, traced the grooves in the floor. A straight line, too perfect to be natural. I fumbled in my pocket for the penknife, my hands so slick with sweat I nearly dropped it. Inserting the tip into the seam, I pried upwards. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a gritty, reluctant scrape, a section of the flagstone lifted, hinged on some ancient, rusted mechanism. A wave of foul, damp air rushed out, carrying the smell of stagnant water, wet stone, and something else, a sweet, cloying odor of decay that was horribly organic. The opening revealed was not a staircase, but a sheer drop into blackness, with iron rungs set into the wall of a narrow, slime-slick shaft. The roar of water was deafening here, magnified and distorted by the stone chimney. This was the access to the mill's underworld, the labyrinth of channels and control gates that lay beneath the grinding room. The plans had indicated the diversion gate was about 12 feet down. It was a descent into the belly of the beast. A change in the cadence of Blackwood's chanting froze me. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was still facing the channel, his arms raised, but the spectral women had turned their heads. They were no longer looking at me with passive anticipation. Their blank faces now held a dawning awareness, a cold curiosity. They saw my divergence from the script. The water in the channel beside them began to churn more violently, and the whispering voices within it grew sharper, more urgent. The spirit knew. It was sensing an intrusion, a threat to its sacrament. There was no more time for stealth. I swung my legs into the hole, my feet finding the first cold, slippery rung. The descent was a nightmare. The rungs were slimy with algae and moss, and the darkness below was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the moonlight from above. The sound was overwhelming, a thunderous cascade that felt like it was crushing my skull. I climbed down, rung by agonizing rung, into the heart of the noise, my world reduced to the feel of cold iron under my hands and the terrifying belief that at any moment, a hand, either living or spectral, would reach down from above and drag me back into the grinding room for my execution. After what felt like an eternity, my foot touched not another rung, but a solid, uneven surface. I was standing in a narrow, arched tunnel, barely wide enough for a man to walk through. A torrent of water rushed through a deep channel to my left, the main flow that powered the wheel above. The air was thick with spray, and the noise was a physical force. By the faint light filtering down the shaft, I saw it, a smaller, secondary channel branching off from the main one, controlled by a heavy, iron sluice gate, its wheel handle thick with rust. This was it. The diversion gate. One turn of that wheel would send the full force of the Blackwater away from the mill, into some forgotten overflow channel. And according to the plans, it would begin the mill's collapse. But as I reached for the wheel, a shadow fell across the shaft of light from above. Silas Blackwood's face appeared at the opening, blocking out the moon. His chanting had stopped. His expression was not one of anger, but of a profound, almost disappointed betrayal. "So, clerk," his voice boomed, amplified by the stone tunnel, easily cutting through the din, "you choose to balance the books with treachery. You would break the covenant." He began to descend the iron rungs, his movements swift and sure, a man completely at home in this subterranean hell. I was trapped between the rushing water and the avenging high priest of the mill. The final confrontation would not be in the ritual space above, but here, in the dark, wet heart of the machine itself. The world shrank to the confines of that dripping stone tunnel. Above, the spectral drama of the ritual continued, a muffled symphony of chanting and otherworldly light, but down here, the conflict was brutally physical. Silas Blackwood descended the iron rungs with the grim purpose of a hangman, his bulk blocking the faint light from above and plunging the channel into near-total darkness. The only illumination came from the phosphorescent foam of the torrent rushing past, casting a sickly, pulsating glow that made the slime on the walls seem to writhe. The roar of the water was a constant, maddening pressure, a sound so immense it felt like it was grinding away my sanity. I had seconds, at most. My original plan, to simply turn the diversion gate and flee, was in ruins. Blackwood was between me and the only escape. My hand, which had been reaching for the rusted iron wheel of the sluice gate, now closed around the only weapon I possessed, the small, sharp penknife. It was a pathetic tool against a man of Blackwood's strength and fanatical resolve, but it was all I had. "You misunderstand the transaction, Gray." Blackwood boomed, his voice a terrifying counterpoint to the water's scream as he dropped the final few feet and landed solidly on the tunnel floor. He advanced slowly, his eyes gleaming in the eerie light. "You think this is about destruction? This is about order. The mill is a perfect system. Life turned to sustenance, energy returned to the source. You would replace this beautiful equation with chaos." He was not merely angry, he was a true believer whose dogma was being profaned. My attempt to sabotage the mill was, in his eyes, The ultimate sacrilege. He lunged for me, not with a fist, but with open hands, aiming to grapple and subdue, to force me back up into the grinding room to complete the ritual. I stumbled backward, the penknife held out before me like a talisman. My back hit the cold, wet stone of the tunnel wall. There was nowhere else to go. The water doesn't just want a life, Blackwood. I shouted, the words tearing from my throat. It's using you. It's draining this land, and you're its servant. A cruel smile twisted his lips. A servant? I am its steward, its partner. We have built an empire here. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist, his grip like iron. The penknife clattered to the stone floor. He began to drag me towards the iron ladder. You will still serve your purpose. The offering will be all the sweeter for your struggle. Desperation lent me a strength I did not know I possessed. I twisted violently, throwing my weight against him. We crashed against the side of the water channel, the force of the impact nearly sending us both into the raging torrent. For a moment, we were locked in a macabre dance at the edge of the abyss, his strength against my frantic will to live. The faces of the women seemed to flash in the water below us, their expressions now agitated, as if the spirit itself was agitated by this disruption. My free hand, scrabbling blindly along the tunnel wall, found purchase on the cold, wet iron of the diversion gate's wheel. With a final, desperate surge of energy, I braced my feet and threw my weight against it. For a heart-stopping moment, it didn't budge, seized by a century of rust and neglect. Then, with a shriek of protesting metal that cut through the water's roar, it turned. Just an inch. But it was enough. A shudder ran through the entire foundation of the mill. It was not a loud sound, but a deep, groaning vibration that I felt in my teeth and bones. The roar of the water directly beside us faltered, its pitch changing as a portion of the flow was suddenly siphoned away. The effect on Blackwood was instantaneous and horrifying. He released me, clutching his chest as if in sudden, acute pain. A strangled cry escaped his lips, not of anger, but of agony and disbelief. "What have you done?" he gasped, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in them before. "You fool! You've broken the balance." The mill groaned again, louder this time. A crack appeared in the tunnel wall above us, snaking its way through the ancient mortar. The vibration intensified, becoming a violent shaking. The perfect, ordered system was fracturing. The spirit of the Blackwater, deprived of the full force of its directed power, was turning chaotic, its energy rebounding against the weakened foundations. The pact was broken. Blackwood stared at me, his face a mask of betrayed fury and primal fear. Then he turned and scrambled back towards the iron ladder, his faith shattered, his only thought now one of self-preservation. But it was too late. With a sound like a cannon shot, a section of the tunnel ceiling gave way. Great stones and a deluge of muddy water crashed down, separating us. I was thrown against the diversion gate, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. The last thing I saw before the world dissolved into chaos was Silas Blackwood, the master of the mill, being swallowed by the collapse of his own terrible creation, his scream lost in the cataclysmic roar of falling stone and unleashed water. The world dissolved into a nightmare of sound and motion. The shriek of tearing stone, the thunder of collapsing masonry, and the triumphant, chaotic roar of the unchained water created a symphony of destruction that dwarfed even the storm's fury. The tunnel around me became a maelstrom. I was thrown from my feet, slammed against the sluice gate I had just turned, the cold iron a brutal anchor in the shifting chaos. Freezing water, thick with peat and debris, surged around my legs, pulling me towards the newly opened channel. The very earth seemed to be convulsing, the foundations of Blackwood Mill giving way after a century of unnatural strain. A massive timber, part of the mill's superstructure, crashed down the access shaft, blocking it completely and plunging my underworld into near total darkness, broken only by the frantic, foaming luminescence of the wild water. Stones rained down, one striking my shoulder with a sickening thud that sent a bolt of white-hot agony through my entire body. I cried out, but the sound was swallowed by the apocalypse. This was it. My desperate act had worked too well. I had not just broken the mill's power, I had triggered its total annihilation, and I was to be buried within its tomb. But the water, now my enemy, also became my savior. The main force of the mill race, deprived of its primary channel, was seeking new paths. The torrent rushing past me intensified, but it was flowing away from the collapsing grinding room, surging with immense force down the overflow channel I had opened. The current grabbed me, tearing my grip from the sluice gate. I was swept off my feet and into the icy, black torrent. It was not a gentle flow, it was a violent, tumbling ride through a stone throat. I was dashed against walls, tumbled over submerged rocks, my body battered and bruised. I held my breath until my lungs burned, certain that at any second I would be pinned by falling debris and drowned. Then, suddenly, there was light. A gray, diffuse glow ahead. The tunnel ended, spewing its contents out into the open air. I was ejected from the bowels of the mill like a piece of refuse, thrown into the churning, swollen waters of the river downstream from the mill pond. I surfaced, gasping and choking, dragging in great, ragged breaths of cold, damp air. The roar was still deafening, but it was the roar of a natural river in flood, not the focused malevolence of the mill race. Treading water, I turned to look back at Blackwood Mill. The site was one of biblical destruction. The great stone structure was buckling in on itself. The water wheel, torn from its mounts, was spinning wildly like a child's toy before it shattered into 1,000 splinters. The roof of the grinding room collapsed inward with a prolonged, grinding crash, sending a plume of dust and spray into the air. The walls swayed, then fell, one after another, into the gaping hole where the foundation had been. The mill was being consumed by the hungry peat bog it had been built upon, the black water claiming its own. It was over in minutes. Where the hulking edifice had stood for a century, there was now only a raging, chaotic whirlpool of debris-choked water, a gaping wound in the landscape. I swam for the far bank, my limbs leaden with exhaustion and cold. I hauled myself onto the muddy shore, collapsing onto the wet grass, vomiting up river water. I lay there, shivering uncontrollably, watching as the last remnants of Silas Blackwood's empire vanished beneath the turbid water. The spectral light was gone. The keening melody was silent. The only sounds were the wind and the rushing river, clean, natural sounds. The oppressive presence that had hung over the valley was broken. But as I lay there, a new horror dawned on me. The collapse had been total. The main house, attached to the mill, had also been pulled down into the sinkhole. Mrs. Higgs. She had been in there. A wave of guilt and sorrow washed over me, colder than the river water. In my quest to destroy the evil, I had likely killed the one innocent soul in that cursed place. My victory felt hollow, stained with an innocent's blood. I had stopped a monster, but I had become a destroyer. The ledger of my life now contained an entry I could never erase. The mill was gone, but its darkness had left a permanent mark on my soul. I had escaped with my life, but I knew, as I lay bleeding and broken on the riverbank, that a part of me had been buried forever in the collapse of Blackwood Mill. I do not know how long I lay on that riverbank, half in the water, my body a canvas of pain and my mind a void of exhaustion and shock. The pre-dawn grayness gave way to a weak, watery sunrise, the light revealing a landscape transformed. The violent churning where the mill had stood began to settle, the peat-brown waters slowly calming, though a great, debris-strewn scar remained on the land. The air, once thick with the mill's oppressive presence, now felt clean and sharp, scoured by the storm and the collapse. The silence was profound, broken only by the normal sounds of the moor, the call of a curlew, the rustle of wind through the heather. The monstrous roar was gone. The whispering was gone. The entity of the Blackwater had been starved of its anchor, its temple destroyed, and had retreated back into the deep, ancient currents of the earth. Pushing myself up onto my elbows sent fresh jags of pain through my shoulder and ribs. Every muscle screamed in protest. I was caked in mud and slime, my clothes torn, my skin a mosaic of cuts and blossoming bruises. But I was alive. The fact seemed impossible, a statistical anomaly in the ledger of fate. I looked at the ruin in the river. Nothing remained above the waterline except a few jagged pieces of wall, like broken teeth in a gaping mouth. Silas Blackwood, his spectral brides, Mrs. Higgs, The entire dark history of the place. All were entombed beneath tons of stone, wood, and peat. I was the sole survivor, the only witness to the mill's final, catastrophic end. The thought of Mrs. Higgs sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. I had condemned her with the same act that had saved myself. Had she been in the kitchen? In her room? Had it been quick? The questions were torment. I had become an agent of the very destruction I had sought to escape. This was the true cost of my victory, a debt of guilt that I would carry for the rest of my days. Driven by a desperate need for evidence, for some tangible proof of the nightmare I had endured, I forced myself to my feet and began to stumble along the riverbank, back towards the site of the main house. The path was a quagmire, churned up by the diverted waters. As I approached, the full extent of the devastation became clear. The house had been utterly obliterated, swallowed by the sinkhole that had consumed the mill. A few pieces of furniture, a splintered chair, a shattered dresser, were lodged in the mud at the water's edge, pathetic relics of a life erased. And then I saw it. Caught in the roots of a half-uprooted willow tree, waterlogged and stained but miraculously intact, was my trunk. The same trunk I had arrived with, containing my clothes, my writing paper, and most importantly, the first official ledger I had been compiling. Next to it, tangled in a bush, was the portfolio containing Elara's drawings. I fell to my knees, scrabbling in the mud to retrieve them. They were sodden, the ink on the ledger pages blurred, the drawings softened at the edges, but they were legible. They were real. These were not phantoms, they were physical proof. But the secret ledger, the true chronicle I had written and hidden beneath the floorboard, that was gone. Buried forever with the mill. A part of me was relieved. That account, written in the white-hot fury of my fear and desperation, contained truths too dark for daylight. Its loss felt like a mercy. The official story would be one of tragic accident. A London clerk, Absalom Gray, arrives to settle an estate. A catastrophic storm undermines the ancient mill's foundations. A collapse claims the lives of the miller and his housekeeper. The clerk narrowly escapes with his life. It was a clean, believable tale. The world did not need to know about whispering water and sacrificial wives. The world would not believe it. It took me the better part of the day to drag my battered body and my salvaged possessions back to the road. I was found by a carter from a neighboring farm, who gaped at my disheveled state and the news of the mill's destruction. He took me to Tavistock, where my story of a structural collapse was met with shock and sympathy. The constable who had been so dismissive before now took my statement with grim seriousness. The mill had been old, the storm unprecedented. It was a tragedy, but a natural one. Within a week, I was on a coach back to London. I looked out the window as we climbed out of the Dartmoor Valley. The landscape was the same, yet fundamentally altered. The oppressive weight was gone. But so was any sense of peace. I had witnessed the abyss, and it had witnessed me. I had looked into the heart of a darkness that defied all reason, and I had done what I thought was necessary to destroy it. But as the city smoke began to stain the horizon, I knew the ledger was not balanced. I had added a column for lives saved, my own, but I had also entered a devastating figure under lives lost, Mrs. Higgs, and an incalculable sum under sanity compromised. The firm of Pynchon and Sons would receive my official report, a masterpiece of omission and half-truths. But the real account, the one written in blood and water on my soul, would remain with me, a silent, screaming testament to the month I spent at Blackwood Mill. The mill was gone, but the grinding of its stones would echo in my dreams forever.